Hey guys, Mr. Klein here with our second lesson of our chapter about the end of the Middle Ages. In particular, the Protestant Reformation and its aftermath, kind of the door slamming shut on the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern period. And it started in the 1500s. Involves lots of famous people, half of all Germans dying, and a massacre in France, which killed about 30,000 people just because they had the crazy idea to go to a different church. So let's go ahead and get started. The late Renaissance period, which was the late 1400s, if you remember from the last lesson on the Renaissance, humanism started taking hold, where people started thinking less about the church and more about the world and natural world, how it worked, led to people beginning to complain about the Catholic Church. Complaints during the Middle Ages about the popes being too political and priests not being very spiritual continued to take hold, and in fact, in some cases, even got worse. Many people thought that the church, like I said, was too political because the pope would regularly get involved in the affairs of other countries, specifically the Holy Roman Empire. Priests, they thought, weren't very spiritual because they were busy, in some cases, taking the offerings from the people in order to become very wealthy, and they especially objected to the sale of what were called indulgences, which were letters from the Pope that excused people from purgatory, which, if you're not familiar with, is the idea that purgatory is a place, according to Catholics, where souls go whenever you die. And you wait there until you either serve your time for your sin or people pray you out. Now, indulgences came, and here's a picture of indulgences being for sale, because the Catholic Church was in need of money, and in particular Pope Leo X, who was the one of the Medicis from the Renaissance, if you remember back, wanted some extra money. These complaints formed the basis of the Protestant Reformation. And the key, the hallmark, the guy who led the Protestant Reformation was a German priest. He was a monk. His name was actually Martin Luther, which Martin Luther King was named after. This guy, Martin Luther, was a German priest, and he really didn't like indulgences. In fact, he didn't like a lot of things that was going on in southern Catholic churches in southern Germany. He called for reform in 1517. And 1517, the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, is pretty much when we say the Middle Ages is done. The Renaissance, that 1350 to 1517 time period, is kind of a transition, but we call the Protestant Reformation beginning the beginning of the modern age. He nailed a list of 95 complaints or 95 theses to a church door in Germany, in Wittenberg, Germany. And on this door nowadays, you actually have the 95 theses engraved on the metal door, but he nailed them on the door, and it was kind of like the local bulletin board, and it was on October 31st of 1517. Yes, Halloween, which, if you know of any diehard Protestants, they call it Reformation Day instead of Halloween because it's when the Protestant Reformation kicked off. This proved to be controversial, and Martin Luther ended up being called at the Diet of Worms. No, not worms, but worms, where he had to call for his stance against the Pope, where a bunch of priests get together. He skillfully defended himself, said he still wanted to be a part of Catholic Church, but rather wanted the Catholic Church reformed. The Catholics had no part of it, and the Pope had him excommunicated, which, if you remember, that meant that he, according to the Pope, he couldn't go to heaven. Luther's ideas quickly, however, spread through Germany thanks to a recent invention of previous century by Johann Gutenberg, known as the printing press. And what the printing press did was, instead of handwriting these documents, they could quickly print copies of Luther's writings. Because Luther was against the Catholic Church, which controlled the Holy Roman Empire, people who didn't like the Holy Roman Empire politically quickly jumped on board. This led to a split politically and religiously, with those supporting Luther becoming known as Protestants, or Lutherans in particular, because they were protesting against the Catholic Church, which led to a Protestant-Catholic split, which we see nowadays in Christianity. Protestants ended up splitting a little bit different due to a reformer by the name of John Calvin, who created the Calvinist sect of Protestantism. John Calvin was a theologian. He said that God knew everything, and as a result, he knew who was going to heaven or going to hell, and as a result, people would be predestined whether to go to heaven or not. So you had a split among the Protestants, with Lutherans, people supporting Martin Luther, and a much smaller version of Calvinists supporting John Calvin. On the other side, you had the Catholics. Now, that's not to say that everyone who did not like what was going on in the Catholic Church left and joined the Protestants. In fact, not all people who disagreed with the Catholic Church became Protestants. Many tried to reform the Catholic Church from within through what was known as the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. It was considered to be a counter to the Protestant Reformation. These Catholics disagreed with some of Martin Luther's teachings on the Bible and purgatory and things like that. And the Catholic leaders met at the Council of Trent to discuss church reforms. In this picture, you have the bishops and the cardinals meeting together at the Council of Trent. And they talked about it. They made new rules for clergy and rejected, most importantly, Protestant beliefs. So even though they called for changes in priests and some things about indulgences, more importantly, they wanted to reject Martin Luther. In order to win back the Catholic support from the Council of Trent, reformers created new religious orders of monks in order to have priests really devoted to Catholic teachings in order to counteract the Protestant growth. One such order was the Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus, founded by the Spanish priest Saint Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuits were really hardcore Catholics who spread Catholicism through the world as missionaries and teachers. And Jesuits, especially in the United States, established universities and places of learning where they could even expand on things about St. Thomas Aquinas and philosophy. They went as far as Japan also, being the first Christian missionaries there. But universities in the United States, such as Boston College, Holy Cross, Xavier, Georgetown, places like that are Jesuit universities, with professors still being Catholics devoted to the Society of Jesus. So that's the religious half of the Protestant Reformation. More importantly than the religious Reformation was the political impact. Really quickly, politicians and kings and barons and all these guys saw the break with Rome with the the Protestants as a way to fight against the power of Rome and the power of Pope and the political power of the Holy Roman Empire. It left Europe pretty much divided, with most of Northern Europe being Protestant, with a little bit of it being Calvinist, and Southern Europe staying Catholic. And so Europe, around the 1600s, was divided between these two. As you can see, green was Catholic. By this time, England split off and joined the Anglican Church, which was essentially the Catholic Church with the King of England as the head of the Anglican Church, but they were decidedly Protestant. The Lutherans up north held this area. Calvinists were in Switzerland, the Netherlands, and southern France, and in Eastern Europe, and in particular the Czech Republic, with Bohemian Moravian brethren here, and Anabaptists here in northern Germany, which is a different group of Protestants there. And as a result, the Holy Roman Empire, which is already, if you remember, just a patchwork of kingdoms with an emperor elected over them, really became a patchwork of divided kingdoms. Kingdoms would change between Catholic and Protestant as soon as the king died. And so people one year would be going to a Catholic church, and then a Protestant king comes to power, and then they have to go to a Protestant church. You had the Peace of Augsburg in the mid-1500s, which generally allowed Lutherans to be okay, but they weren't going to have any of these Calvinists at all. They were, and Anabaptists or anybody else. They were roundly persecuted. But in France, there were a large number of people who remained Catholic, mainly in the north, but in southern France there was a large number of Protestants called Huguenots. And the Huguenots were declared illegal by the king, sparking decades of violence between the two sides. And throughout the 1500s, there were the French Wars of Religion. And this culminated with the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which started on St. Bartholomew's Day in August in the 1500s and went through October. And anywhere to 5,000 to 25,000 Frenchmen were killed because they were Protestants. Protestants were horrified across Europe, and they said that this really galvanized the Protestants and said that the Catholic Church was evil, and politicians who opposed the Pope needed to be backed by violence, if necessary, and through war. And the Catholics and Protestants and the Huguenots continued to fight in Europe until the French king became Protestant, and the Treaty of Nantes, the Edict of Nantes came to pass, calling religious freedom for all. It didn't quite stay there, and a lot of Huguenots left and went to the United States, South Africa, even Brazil, and scattered throughout Europe, but the beginnings of religious freedom was there. The Holy Roman Empire fared no better, with Protestants and Catholics fighting across Germany throughout the 1500s, and it really kicked off in 1618 in a war called the 30 Years' War. Care to guess how long it lasted? If you said 30 years, you're correct. 1618 to 1648. It was the biggest war of the wars of religion, and it began in 1618 with the Second Defenestration of Prague, where a Catholic king was tossed out of the window in protest by Protestant protesters and rebels who did not want the Catholic king and the Holy Roman Emperor telling them what church to worship at. This was a really big and complicated war, and even for English speakers, it's even more complicated because most of the sources are in German. What's considered to be the primary English account of the 30 Years' War was written in the 1930s. A book written in 2011, weighing in at over 900 pages, is probably the best modern version, but the book written in the 1930s is still considered to be authoritative. It went through 4 stages. First, the revolt in the Czech Republic, which began with the Second Defenestration of Prague. This was right here. And it quickly spread through Germany, where Protestants and Catholics began fighting over control of the Holy Roman Empire in Germany. The 30 Years' War was really important because it was the widespread use of guns and firearms. Even though the pike, or the really long pole, was still the mainstay of warfare, by the end you had cannons and guns, much like you would see in modern warfare take place. And these are some reenactors dressing like it. The war spread really quickly throughout Germany. Denmark quickly joined the war against the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholics, but they were defeated by the Catholics, who began marching all over Europe, terrorizing Protestants everywhere. And the Danish lost and left. The Swedes entered the war, and that's when we considered the turning point of the war, through Gustav Adolf II, or Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North. The fire-breathing Protestant king of Sweden landed with a 30,000-man force and marched throughout Germany, terrorizing Catholics everywhere, killing and converting wherever he went. The 30 Years' War was marked by violence and bloodshed and just outright atrocities by both sides, because really quickly both sides forgot about it being a Catholic versus Protestant war. In fact, by the end, the Catholics in France were fighting on the Protestant side against other Catholics. Hangings, murder, pillage was widespread, and the war, traveling across Germany for 30 years, led to Germany losing half of its population by the end of the war in 1648. And like I said, after the 30 Years' War was the Peace of Westphalia. European rulers made an agreement at the Peace of Westphalia that allowed the rulers to decide the religion of their countries. This was an important step for religious freedom. You could worship at whatever church you kind of wanted. Protestants and Lutherans really kind of let them worship wherever they want, provided it was Christian, mind you. But the king decided what religion they would be. The Reformation also led to the development of new countries such as the Netherlands, which gained its freedom through an 80-year war, which culminated against Spain, which culminated with the Peace of Westphalia. This is how Europe looked like. Sweden and Denmark became really powerful. Bohemia and Austria, which is the Czech Republic right here, under the Holy Roman Empire, was severely weakened. Germany continued to be a patchwork. And it got even worse if you look at this. This is the Holy Roman Empire. All of this stuff were individual German kingdoms and dukedoms and things like that. But more importantly, it led to social and political changes. Most people had no say in how the Catholic Church was governed. The Pope was in charge. They had their governmental system set up. And the Catholic states down here in Southern Europe tended to be really absolutist monarchies with the king in charge, allying itself more with the Catholic idea. However, Protestant churches, each of the congregations made their own rules, which in the case of the Dutch Republic here and in England and Sweden and Norway and even places in Germany, you started seeing the seeds of self-government. National rulers had to share their power because it was based on these ideas in their church, with local governments in a system called federalism, which in a place like Germany with so many kingdoms began to be really important. Germany was divided until 1871 with the Franco-Prussian War. And the Peace of Westphalia and this area of Europe really led to the modern political system where countries had governments and people had certain rights and things like that. And it's really spread from there. So there you go. That's your lesson. Really long. The Protestant Reformation was started by Martin Luther, who was angry at indulgences being sold, which allowed people to skip purgatory and go straight to heaven. He nailed his 95 Theses against the wall and was promptly excommunicated by the Catholic Church. His teachings spread really quickly through the printing press, leading to the Protestant Reformation. The Catholics got together and denounced his work, but also worked to reform some of the ways in the Catholic Reformation. The Jesuits were the main force of the Counter-Reformation, pushing against these the Protestant ideas. The Protestant Reformation quickly became political. In France, Huguenots were killed because of their religion, and the 30 Years' War began with a king being thrown out of his window in the Czech Republic. The 30 Years' War led to widespread atrocities all across Europe as people marched all over Germany, killing about half of the population. The tide turned against the Catholics with the entrance of Sweden and Gustav Adolf II in the war. And by the end, Germany was divided into a patchwork of states, and the modern nation-state and modern concept of government came into being, but Germany became very, very divided and would remain so for nearly 200 more years. So there you go. That's your lesson. A really important time in history discussed. So I know it went a little bit long, but as you know, if you have any questions, please let me know, and thanks for watching.